My fiancée said. If you really loved me, you'd trust me completely, while refusing to explain why she was out till 4 a.m. I said, if you really loved me, you'd give me a reason to, and called off the wedding. She spent hours to clarify what she actually meant. I, 29M, never thought I'd be the type to call off a wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony. But here I am, staring at the engagement ring sitting on my kitchen counter like it's evidence from a crime scene. It started last Tuesday when my fiancée came home at 4:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake since midnight, checking my phone every few minutes. She'd told me she was having dinner with her college roommate, who was visiting from Portland. Dinner that apparently lasted 9 hours. The sound of her key in the lock made my stomach drop. I pretended to be asleep as she crept into our bedroom, but the smell hit me immediately, cigarettes and cologne that definitely wasn't mine. She hadn't smoked since college, and I'd never worn anything that musky in my life. When I asked her about it the next morning, she got defensive faster than I'd ever seen. She said her friend's boyfriend had joined them. They'd gone to a few bars, lost track of time. Simple explanation. But when I asked which bars, she couldn't remember the names. When I asked why she hadn't answered my texts after 11 p.m., she said her phone had died. I wanted to believe her. We'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months. I'd already put down deposits, sent invitations, arranged time off work for our honeymoon. But something felt wrong, like when you're sure you've locked the front door, but can't shake the feeling you haven't. The second incident happened 4 days later. She said she was working late on a big project, wouldn't be home until around 10 p.m. At 11:30, I drove by her office building. The parking lot was empty except for a security guard's car. I sat there for 20 minutes, feeling like a paranoid fool, before driving home. She arrived at 1:45 a.m. with another story about grabbing drinks with coworkers to celebrate finishing the project. When I mentioned I'd driven by her office, her face went white for just a second before she accused me of stalking her. The word hit like a slap. That's when she first said it. If you really loved me, you'd trust me completely. She was standing in our kitchen, still in her work clothes, but with makeup that looked freshly applied, telling me that questioning her whereabouts meant I didn't love her enough. I spent the next week trying to convince myself she was right. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe 3 years together should have earned her more benefit of the doubt. But the pit in my stomach kept growing, especially when I noticed she'd started keeping her phone face down and had changed her passcode. The breaking point came last Friday. She said she was going to her sister's place to help plan a surprise birthday party for their mom. I knew her sister lived about 40 minutes away, so when she wasn't back by midnight, I started worrying something had happened. I called her sister. Her sister sounded confused when I asked if they were still working on party plans. She told me they'd finished everything earlier that week and that my fiancé hadn't been there at all. The surprise party was actually the following weekend, and all the planning was already done. I hung up feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me. When she finally came home at 3:20 a.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I told her I called her sister. I watched her face cycle through surprise, anger, and then something that looked almost like relief. She asked why I was checking up on her, why I couldn't just trust her to tell the truth. That's when she said it again, with more conviction this time. If you really loved me, you'd trust me completely. She was standing in the doorway, car keys still in her hand, looking at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. The words that came out of my mouth surprised even me. If you really loved me, you'd give me a reason to. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. I told her I was calling off the wedding. I said I couldn't marry someone who thought love meant accepting lies without question. She stared at me for a long moment, then went upstairs. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of a suitcase zipper. 20 minutes later, she was gone. Update 1. She started calling the next morning. 47 calls in one day. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages began apologetic. She was sorry for lying, sorry for making me worry, sorry for everything. But she still wasn't explaining where she'd actually been or who she'd been with. By evening, the tone changed. She was angry now, saying I was throwing away 3 years over nothing, that I was being immature and controlling. She said her friends had warned her about men like me, men who couldn't handle independent women. I almost called her back after that message. Almost. But then I remembered the cologne smell, the fresh makeup at 1:45 a.m., the lies that came so easily, she barely had to think about them. My sister called me Sunday morning. She said she'd gotten a long message from my ex-fiancé explaining how I'd become obsessively jealous and called off the wedding over her having friends I didn't approve of. My sister asked if that was really what happened. I told her everything. About the late nights, the lies, the deflection. My sister was quiet for a long time before she said she'd never trusted my ex anyway. Something about how she always seemed to be performing, like she was auditioning for the role of perfect girlfriend rather than actually being one. Monday brought a new strategy. My ex started involving other people. My mom called saying she'd received a tearful phone call about how much my ex missed me and wanted to work things out. My best friend got a similar call. Even my boss mentioned that my fiancé had stopped by the office asking if I was okay. She was building a narrative where she was the heartbroken victim of my unreasonable jealousy. Part of me admired the strategy, even as it made me sick. Update 2. The breakthrough came Tuesday evening. My phone rang at 7:30 p.m. with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was a man's voice asking if this was the right number for my ex-fiancée's boyfriend. He sounded nervous, uncertain. He said his name was Marcus and that he needed to tell me something. He'd been seeing my fiancée for 2 months. He'd had no idea she was engaged until he saw our engagement photos on her social media. She told him we'd broken up months ago and were just living together until the lease ended. Marcus said he'd confronted her about it that morning when he finally worked up the courage. She tried to convince him that I was just a roommate who was obsessed with her, that she'd been trying to get rid of me, but I wouldn't leave. When he didn't buy it, she'd admitted we were engaged but claimed it was just for immigration purposes, a green card marriage that meant nothing. He said he felt sick when he realized he'd been helping her cheat. He'd found my number in her phone and decided he had to tell me the truth. He also mentioned that she'd spent those late nights at his apartment, which explained the cologne smell and why she couldn't remember the names of bars. There hadn't been any bars. I thanked him and hung up feeling strangely empty. Part of me was relieved to finally know the truth. Another part was devastated that my instincts had been right all along. An hour later, my phone started ringing again. This time it was her. She said she needed to see me, that she had something important to explain. She said she'd been wanting to tell me something for weeks, but hadn't known how. Her voice was different, smaller, less confident than I'd heard in months. I told her Marcus had already called. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She said she could explain everything if I'd just give her a chance. Update 3. We met at a coffee shop downtown the next evening. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, hair that hadn't been washed in days, clothes that didn't quite fit right. This wasn't the polished woman who'd been lying to me for months. She started talking before I'd even sat down. She said she'd been planning to break up with me for weeks, but couldn't figure out how to do it without destroying both our lives. The wedding deposits, the apartment lease, the shared credit cards, everything was tangled together. She said she'd met Marcus at a work conference and realized she didn't love me the way she should. She said she'd been trying to work up the courage to call off the wedding herself, but kept losing her nerve. She'd thought if she could just make it through the ceremony, maybe the feelings would come back. Maybe marriage would fix whatever was broken between us. She admitted the late nights, the lies, all of it. She said she knew it was wrong, but felt trapped by the momentum of our relationship. Everyone expected us to get married. Our families were excited. Her parents had already bought plane tickets. She said when I called off the wedding, part of her had been relieved. She didn't have to be the villain anymore. She could let me think she was cheating instead of admitting she'd fallen out of love months ago. But then Marcus had confronted her, and she realized how many lies she'd built up. She said she'd spent the last few days thinking about what kind of person she'd become. Someone who could lie so easily, who could hurt someone she'd once loved just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. She said she was sorry, not just for the cheating, but for the cowardice, for choosing deception over honesty, for making me feel crazy when my instincts were telling me the truth. I sat there listening, feeling like I was watching someone I'd never met before. This vulnerable, broken person wasn't the confident woman I'd fallen in love with. But maybe that confident woman had been a performance all along. She asked if there was any chance we could work through it, if we could postpone the wedding and try counseling. She said she'd end things with Marcus, that she'd do whatever it took to earn back my trust. I looked at her across the small table, remembering the woman who'd stood in our kitchen 3 weeks ago telling me that love meant blind trust. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was losing my mind. All the times she'd made me feel like my concerns were character flaws. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but it was too late. Not because of the cheating, I might have been able to forgive that, but because of how easily she'd lied, how she'd turned my reasonable questions into evidence of my inadequacy. Trust wasn't just about fidelity. It was about feeling safe enough to voice concerns without being made to feel paranoid or controlling. I told her that someone who really loved me would have had the courage to end things before starting something new. Someone who really loved me wouldn't have spent weeks making me question my own sanity. She cried then, quietly, without trying to hide it or make me comfort her. She said she understood and that she hoped I'd find someone who deserved me. I left her sitting in that coffee shop and walked home through downtown, past all the places we'd made plans for a future that had never really existed. The engagement ring was still sitting on my kitchen counter when I got home, but somehow it didn't look like evidence anymore. It just looked like jewelry. I called the wedding venues the next morning and started the process of canceling everything. Most of the vendors were understanding, especially when I mentioned the circumstances. Some of the deposits were non-refundable, but that seemed like a small price to pay for discovering the truth before walking down an aisle towards someone who was already walking away. 3 months later, I'm glad I trusted my instincts. I learned that love isn't about blind faith. It's about building something strong enough to withstand honest questions. Real love doesn't ask you to ignore red flags. It gives you reasons not to need them in the first place. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something everyone expects you to want, especially when you know in your gut it's not right. I'm still learning to trust myself again, but at least now I know what real trust should feel like, and what it definitely shouldn't. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe.